For a coup in Panama today, saying the Panamanian people and that country's defense forces should, and we quote here, do everything to get him out of office. The president's comments came aboard Air Force One while on a trip through Mississippi for a series of college commencement speeches. White House correspondent Wyatt Andrews is our report.
In a calculated move to turn up the heat, President Bush invited reporters to his cabin on Air Force One and called on the Panamanian Defense Forces to oust their commander, General Manuel Noriega.
Whatever it is that it takes to get him out of there right now, and that's what I'd like to see happen. No, I would add no words of caution. The will of the people should be implemented. The will of the people should not be thwarted by this man and a handful of these Doberman thugs.
Mr. Bush took pains to address the Panamanian military directly, saying the United States does not blame the defense forces for this week's violence, that they would, in effect, be embraced by the United States if they desert their leader.
All I want them to know is that if they get rid of Noriega, they will have an instant normalization of relationship with the United States, and there will be a useful role for the Panamanian Defense Force.
As if confident that Noriega will leave sooner or later, the president even suggested that the dictator consider leaving for a country where the U.S. cannot touch him, where the U.S. could not pursue its drug indictment against him.
I am obligated as the President of the United States to respect our laws and to go forward on fulfilling obligations under the law. But if he went to a place where there wasn't any extradition treaty, then that would be a different situation.
The president's call for the ouster of Manuel Noriega raises the stakes in the U.S. campaign against him. It suggests that the administration believes anti-Noriega sentiment may be close to peaking. If forces loyal to Manuel Noriega were looking for some sort of signal to defect, the president today was happy to give it. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Starkville, Mississippi.
The tough talk from the president came as U.S. Army troops beefed up security at American military installations in Panama and amid new signs that the Roman Catholic Church will take a tougher line against the Panamanian dictator tomorrow. More on all that now from Juan Vasquez.
As American troops continue to arrive in Panama, commanding officers insist their plan is not to make war on General Noriega, not to intimidate him.
So my orders are to assist the USARSO, or Southern Command, in the protection of U.S. personnel as well as U.S. facilities.
U.S. officials here underline the same view. Getting rid of Noriega is up to the people of Panama, they say, and American actions will depend largely on what the Panamanians themselves do. In a new challenge to Noriega, the Roman Catholic Church has taken a more active role against the regime and applauded the activity of the opposition. The appearance of opposition leader Ricardo Arias Calderon at a birthday mass for presidential candidate Guillermo Endara almost turned into a political rally. An official declaration of the church condemning the nullification of the elections will be read at masses around the country tomorrow.
We are calling for all the people to gather around the churches on Sunday from 10 to 12 and to give way to their imagination in peaceful means of protest.
In a change of tactics, the opposition is also calling for a general strike to shut down the city on Wednesday. The leaders insist they are going to keep fighting Noriega one way or the other.
President-elect Endara, Vice President-elect Arias Calderon, and myself will not be in hiding. We will continue to lead them without taking them to the butcher house. We do not want confrontation.
The tactic of a general strike has been tried before against Noriega. It had little effect. But this time, the opposition believes it has the momentum and the international diplomatic support to wage a successful fight. Juan Vasquez, CBS News, Panama City.
The size of the American force in Panama continued to increase today, and we got details on that now from James Hattori in Louisiana.
A second wave of U.S. troops is headed for Panama today. 700 soldiers and some heavy-duty firepower. More than 170 armored carriers and trucks from Fort Polk, Louisiana.
I hope and pray that they're not going to get into a position where there's actual combat. I hope that their presence is all that is required down there to do whatever it is that we need to do.
Like all U.S. forces in Panama, the 5th Infantry's mission is defensive. And while many of the vehicles going with them are capable of evacuating civilians, they can also be used to fire machine guns and mortars.
Moves quick. We got some protection in it. And it is much more speedy, and it's more lethal.
This afternoon, a convoy of support vehicles headed to Beaumont, Texas, where a ship will sea-lift them to Panama. But most of the troops and equipment are being flown to Central America from nearby England Air Force Base. All should arrive within a few days. It's the first time this unit has been deployed overseas since Vietnam, and the GIs are enthusiastic about President Bush's decision to send them.
I think we've been kind of walked on before, and it's just insane we're not going to let that happen this time.
The guys here are proud because they feel like they've been chosen from among, all the units in the Army.
The extra U.S. troops will remain in Panama for an indefinite period. Their stay determined less by the Defense Department than by the actions of one Panamanian general. James Hattori, CBS News, Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze said today that if NATO modernizes its short-range missiles, the Kremlin might build new short-range missiles of its own. He also said that the Kremlin might stop dismantling intermediate-range missiles, which would violate the new INF treaty. Well, still ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, the embarrassing problem of facing Chinese leaders on the eve of Gorbachev's arrival. And later, we'll have a Kentucky community which is looking for comfort on a painful anniversary.
Fat chance. Finding a faucet made as well as a price fister. After all, it's the one made in its own USA foundry. The one uniquely fashioned with a heart of solid brass. Start to finish, the quality is first rate. Furthermore, the cost is a fraction of what you'd expect. So why fiddle around? Get a price fister. The fabulous faucet with a funny name.
This is John Overly, and this is his farm. It's the Benjamin Moore Paint Farm. Out here, John tests thousands of Benjamin Moore paints to make sure they'll withstand years of sun and cold, rain and snow without cracking, peeling, or fading. These tests help make Benjamin Moore the only paint good enough for the Reynolds family and their new home. They wouldn't settle for anything less, would you?
When something means so much, see your Benjamin Moore dealer.
Hart's Blockade keeps fleas and ticks from getting on your pet. Scientific tests verify that Hart's Blockade repellent gives effective flea and tick protection for dogs and cats. With our new test data, you can be assured of both your pet's comfort and total protection or your money back. Used as directed, no other product we've tested is as effective for the control of fleas and ticks. Call this toll-free number for more information. Hart's Blockade, clinically proven flea and tick protection that really works.
The leaders of China are wrestling tonight with a monumental dilemma. It's yet another student protest in Beijing's main square, and it could prove a major embarrassment when Soviet President Gorbachev arrives on Monday. John Sheehan reports.
Pro-democracy students escalated their struggle against the communist system with another defiant march and a hunger strike they say will go on until they win democratic freedoms or die. Many wrote letters of farewell to their parents.
We prefer dying to dictatorship.
With Beijing all prepared for the arrival next week of President Mikhail Gorbachev and the first Sino-Soviet summit in 30 years, the hunger strikers marched into the city, supported by thousands of their schoolmates.
The students say they intend to camp right here at Tiananmen Square. That poses a problem for the authorities because it's very close to the spot where the government plans a military welcome ceremony on Monday for Gorbachev.
At the Russian embassy, other students delivered invitations for the Soviet president to visit their campuses. Students from Tsinghua University carried a banner in Russian saying, "Demokratia, our common ideal." As the protesters settled in for a chilly night in the square, the government announced that it will hold talks with several student organizations on Monday. It was unclear, however, whether communist authorities mean these students or once again only representatives of state-approved campus organizations that the protesters reject. The rebel students say that either the government capitulates or Gorbachev will get a close-up look at glasnost, Chinese style. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
In the early days, the Chinese communists used the Soviet Union as a role model, but today the tables are turned, at least on official Soviet television, and Barry Peterson in Moscow has that story.
The pictures are China, the words Russian. And here, the people of China singing Russian songs. It's a Soviet television documentary doing what the Soviets do best, rehabilitating the image of an enemy officially becoming a friend again. The Soviets taught the Chinese about communism. Now the Soviets are using the Chinese to teach their own people about how communism can change, showing off China's new ways in the hope clearly that those new ways may transplant here. Example, the opening of a stock market in a Chinese city, reported not just with approval by Soviet television, but with emphasis on what the profits can buy, television sets and refrigerators. There's no mention of recent Chinese efforts to choke off economic growth. Instead, the Soviet announcer says the experiment has brought positive results. And, he added, almost sadly, think of all our billions of rubles doing nothing. And there is more. From cement factories to cooperative Chinese restaurants. It's done for profit is the theme, and the image of China is the image of reform that works.
What are their lessons, so to say? And many of these lessons, we feel, are very good to take.
As Soviets stand in lines that are longer lately, to buy food that is harder to find lately, they contemplate the good of China, but are rarely told the bad, such as the reported staggering 30% inflation rate and other problems that are slowing China's long march to a better life. Instead, to Soviet eyes, China is prosperity. We must learn, the Soviets tell their own people, how to dance to modern China's tune. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
CBS News coverage of the Sino-Soviet summit starts tomorrow when Charles Kuralt anchors Sunday morning from Beijing. Dan Rather, of course, will be broadcasting the CBS Evening News all next week from inside Beijing's Forbidden City. There are runoff parliamentary elections tomorrow in the Soviet Union in districts where no candidate won a majority. For one candidate, victory could mean a big change in social status. We have more on that now from Jonathan Sanders.
As Soviet citizens discuss how to vote in the final rounds of elections to the new Chamber of Deputies, many of them are still absorbing the results of earlier rounds. Results that produced an earthquake in the Soviet system. Dissidents and mavericks have been elected. Many party officials have been challenged and rejected. But party leaders aren't the only ones who've been neglected. The Soviet Union is supposed to be a workers' state, but until now, not too many workers have been running successfully for office. Enter Vasily Romashkin. Many think he is the last best hope for workers to have their own man on the new council. He's pitted against 6 other candidates, famous writers and lawyers. Don't we have enough intellectuals already elected, he asks? Don't we need someone from the shop floor to really speak for the workers? Like most candidates on election eve, Vasily Romashkin is optimistic about his chances. If he does win, he would become a working-class hero, a title that still carries its own special meaning, even in Mikhail Gorbachev's new Soviet Union. Jonathan Sanders, CBS News, Moscow.
An elderly British man apparently has been kidnapped near his home in Muslim West Beirut. A previously unknown terrorist group claims responsibility for this one. The hostage is identified as Jack Mann, a former Royal Air Force and airline pilot who's lived in Beirut much of his life. From our Washington notebook tonight, what does next week's meeting between Soviet and Chinese leaders mean for the United States? That was a question for experts on both China and the Soviet Union this week, and here's how they see it.
It signals an end to the Sino-Soviet dispute, which has really dominated East Asian strategic matters for nearly 2 decades now. We've lived off that dispute. We're now going to have to live with the results of an improved Sino-Soviet relationship.
It's been 30 years since Chinese and Soviet leaders sat down and agreed on anything, and in many ways that suited the United States just fine. Both communist giants had to devote a lot of time and money on forces to defend themselves from each other. The possibility that all that could now change makes U.S. policy experts a little nervous.
I think our principal concern is that the rapprochement between the two communist countries does not go too far. In other words, back to the old alliance which was directed against us.
The worry is not so much that the global balance of power will be shaken, since the two communist leaders are meeting at a time when both their countries are being rocked by internal problems. But improved Sino-Soviet relations could make the Soviet Union a much more active player in an area where the United States has big security and economic stakes: Cambodia, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan.
I believe the real objective of Soviet policy in the region is Japan, and that the Soviets have concluded that the route to Tokyo is through Beijing.
By warming up to China, the Soviet Union hopes to convince Japan that it is no longer a hostile neighbor. The Russians want access to Japanese markets and money and will push for disarmament in the Pacific. That could pose obvious complications in U.S. relations with Japan, and especially with American efforts to convince the Japanese to take a greater share of the defense burden in the Far East.
In which case Japan would find itself somewhat in the situation of Europe of not facing a major threat. And of course that's difficult for us to adjust to this new world in which the Russian threat is receding.
But experts also stress that improved Sino-Soviet relations may also produce substantial benefits for the United States. In the nuclear age, reducing tension and the threat of war is good for everyone, and could make it easier for both countries to strengthen their ties with the West.
They need our markets. They need our technology. The Bush administration would be well advised to begin thinking about these evolutionary changes in Asia and how we can get ahead of them, or at least keep up with them.
What we see are two sides getting together to establish a more stable relationship, and they're trying to catch up in some sense with us.
And to help that along, the United States bowed to Soviet wishes today and postponed a visit of U.S. ships to Shanghai, which had originally been scheduled for the same day that Soviet leader Gorbachev was stopping off there. The Soviets reportedly felt the ship's arrival had been planned to upstage the Soviet leader, so today it was announced the ship's arrival will be put off for 1 day.
You're on your way.
Who would have figured it? I grow up in the city and end up testing products for the farm, like this one from Dow. We study its effects in the classroom and check the results in the field. It yields more food, more profits for family farmers, and greater groundwater protection. But Dow gave me a grant to find out how to make it work even better. You know,
the Environmental Protection Agency conceded tonight that it underestimated the percentage of the U.S. apple crop treated with the chemical Alar. The EPA, which first said it was 5%, now says it could be as high as 15%. Well, the CBS News broadcast 60 Minutes, which first broke the Alar story, will report tomorrow night that the figure, according to their tests, is much higher than that even, more than 30%. The EPA is now taking steps to ban Alar, a fruit ripening agent linked to cancer in mice. A fourth body was recovered today from the train wreck in San Bernardino, California. Investigators still don't know why the freight train went out of control and derailed yesterday, demolishing 6 houses. Christopher Shaw was trapped in the wreckage of his house more than 13 hours before rescue workers finally reached him.
He dug in the right place. You know, it was my luck that they dug right where I was, because they didn't know where I was. It was my luck. I had the Lord on my side at that time. I did.
American fishermen are demanding action to stop illegal raids on Pacific salmon fisheries by Asian boats. Congress has given the State Department until the end of next month to reach a resolution of the problem with Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Tonight, Jerry Bowen has a report on that.
For decades, the salmon fishermen of Westport, Washington have navigated around the weather and weak prices to stay in business. Now they face a new threat, pirates.
Suddenly we have a new predator out there.
The pirates are mostly Asian fishing boats, mostly from Taiwan, say U.S. investigators, and they're raiding the valuable salmon fishery that stretches across the vast northern Pacific, catching small, immature fish in violation of international treaties and making enormous profits in the process. The evidence in just one case is in storage now in a Seattle warehouse. 200,000 pounds of illegally caught salmon, part of a $47 million scheme involving a Japanese businessman who's to be arraigned on Monday. One case among many.
While we only seized about 1.5 million pounds, we documented that another 10 million pounds had gone through the system without us knowing about it.
As troubling as the violations is the technology. Immense drift nets that measure 30 feet deep and 30 miles long.
They strip mine everything in their path. That includes marine birds, marine mammals, as well as all species of fish. And there's anywhere from 700 to 1,000 vessels fishing like this at any one time.
Ostensibly, the pirate boats are fishing for squid, but the young salmon bring a much higher price, 100 times higher at fish markets from Japan to Thailand. And enforcement is difficult. By the time the Coast Guard caught up with this Taiwanese vessel last month, it was 450 miles north of the legal boundary. Its massive drift net and ship's logs were mysteriously missing. The only evidence found was one scale, 2 fins, and fish impressions on ice.
I think that we are rupturing the food chain in the ocean, and we don't even begin to know what the ripple effect may be.
For now, Japan has agreed to have a handful of observers placed on its drift net fleet, but there's no agreement with Taiwan, and critics say what's really needed is a seafood trade embargo to bring the Asian nations in line. In Westport, Washington, the fishermen say what they really need is a break from the weather, the prices, and now the pirates. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
One year ago this weekend, 24 children and 3 adults were killed in this country's worst ever alcohol-related highway accident. Tomorrow, Radcliffe, Kentucky will remember the victims. Gary Reeves reports.
As workers put the final touches on the monument engraved with the names of the bus crash victims, many here wonder if the pain from the year-old tragedy will ever subside.
I feel like I'm climbing out of a pit, and I'm not there yet.
It was Saturday night 1 year ago when Radcliffe's long nightmare began. An alleged drunk driver slammed head-on into a church bus, killing 27. The driver is free on bail until his murder trial starts in November. But in Radcliffe, where everyone knows a victim, few are free from the painful memories.
We are still devastated to a certain extent. Yes, we're healing, but nevertheless, there is a sense of loss.
The loss is greatest in the homes of the victims. 22 families lost a child. Lee Williams lost both children and his wife.
People were in the church crying, how are we going to make it because our son's gone? How are we going to make it because our daughter's gone? I don't have anybody. How would you like to answer my question? How in the world am I going to make it?
He's made it so far by depending on his friends and his church, where Pastor Don Tennyson is helping plan tomorrow's memorial service to remind the survivors that the community still cares.
People can be around all kinds of people and be alone. And we're wanting these people to recognize they are not alone.
The anniversary is dredging up painful memories. The victims' families hope tomorrow's event relieves the stress.
Maybe it'll be like closing a chapter in a book. The first year chapter is closed. But then there's that new chapter that has to be open, and it's got to be titled Ongoing Life.
Some say the memorial service is not just for the families. Like this monument, it's for an entire community that is still grieving and still struggling to get by. Gary Reeves, CBS News, Radcliffe, Kentucky.
And that's our report. Good night.
This is CBS.